So Donald Trump's first press conference in 6 months and his first as president-elect, and it was highly unusual and at times explosive. The event had been scheduled for Mr. Trump to announce how he'd handle his vast business empire while president. Instead, it was dominated by allegations carried by some US media organizations that his election team colluded with Russia and that there were compromising private videos of him held by the Russian security services. Our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins has this report.
Donald Trump is 9 days away from inauguration as president and America's commander-in-chief, but his path to the White House is now tangled in extraordinary controversy. What role might the Kremlin under President Putin have played? To help Mr. Trump, to undermine Hillary Clinton, and perhaps also to gather compromising material to use against President Trump once he's in power.
My friend and the President-elect of the United States of America, Donald Trump.
This afternoon, Donald Trump was blunt. The allegations against him are totally untrue, designed to undermine him.
Thank you very much. It's all fake news. It's phony stuff. It didn't happen. And it was gotten by opponents of ours, as you know, because you reported it, and so did many of the other people. It was a group of opponents that got together, sick people, and they put that crap together.
So what could Moscow's role have been? In shadowy work both to promote Donald Trump and also gain a hold over him. Here he is visiting the Russian capital in 2013 for the Miss Universe pageant, then co-owned by Mr. Trump. The most lurid claim is that he used the same hotel suite which President Obama had stayed in for unusual acts involving sex workers, all of it allegedly recorded by Russian spy cameras and microphones.
I was in Russia years ago with the Miss Universe contest, which did very well. Moscow, the Moscow area, did very, very well. And I told many people, be careful, because you don't want to see yourself on television. Cameras all over the place. And again, not just Russia, all over. Does anyone really believe that story? I'm also very much of a germaphobe, by the way.
The source for the unproved claims is said to be a former British spy, an ex-MI6 officer who was once based in Moscow. Today, Dmitry Peskov, President Putin's spokesman, said the allegations were pulp fiction, a clear attempt to damage relations. Mr. Trump says he's in no way compromised by Vladimir Putin's preference for him as the next president.
If Putin likes Donald Trump, I consider that an asset, not a liability, because we have a horrible relationship with Russia. Russia can help us fight ISIS, which, by the way, is #1 tricky. I don't know that I'm going to get along with Vladimir Putin. I hope I do, but there's a good chance I won't. And if I don't, do you honestly believe that Hillary would be tougher on Putin than me? Does anybody in this room really believe that? Give me a break. Okay.
The press conference got most heated when CNN, one news organization which has covered the latest allegations extensively, tried to put a question.
Since you are attacking our news organization,
not you.
Can you give us a chance?
Your organization is terrible.
You are attacking our news organization.
Your organization is terrible.
Can you give us a question?
Don't be rude. No, I'm not going to give you a question. I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you state categorically?
You are fake news.
Sir, can you
go, these papers are just some of the many documents.
Mr. Trump also used the occasion to display some of the legal documents, turning his businesses over to his family. It's his response to accusations of future conflicts of interest. But the controversies surrounding Donald Trump and Russia are not going away. Those who voted for him and those who rejected him all know his presidency will be a stormy one. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, the BBC has known about those allegations against Mr. Trump for a while, but decided to report on them after it became clear that the US intelligence agencies were taking them seriously enough to brief the president and the president-elect on them. Paul Wood's been following the story for months. He's told us more about the claims.
Well, this is a series of reports. The first one was written in June, the last one in October, commissioned by an opposition research company funded by a Democratic Party donor, but actually written by a British former MI6 agent. And he spoke to members of the Russian security service, the FSB, paying them for information, but several of those FSB officers told him there was a blackmail tape. Now, I understand that the CIA believes this is credible and takes it seriously. That is not the same as them endorsing it or saying it is accurate. but I passed a message through an intermediary to the case officers dealing with this file. And the message came back that there was more than one tape, there was audio as well as video, it was on more than one date and in more than one place, not just the presidential suite of the Ritz-Carlton in Moscow, but St. Petersburg as well. And in addition to that, it is not just the MI6 officer who is the source for this. I was told by a retired spy back in August that the head of an East European intelligence agency had told him also of the existence of a blackmail tape on the Republican presidential candidate. Now, having said all that, these are allegations, nobody has seen the tape, and Mr. Trump is literally correct when he said so far this is unsubstantiated.
Paul Wood in Washington. Let's talk to the BBC's Rajini Vaidyanathan, also in Washington. Rajini, an extremely heated news conference at times, but did Donald Trump do an effective job of dismissing the furore over the allegations and turn the conversation back to what he wanted to talk about?
He certainly tried to, but reporters in that news conference continued to ask him questions about those unverified reports, about his relationship with the intelligence community and indeed about his business dealings, which was originally the reason why he hosted this news conference in the first place. I think some of the key takeaways from that news conference are, when it comes to those three areas that I mentioned, the relationship with Russia, the relationship with his business dealings and the intelligence community, is it all just shows how unpredictable the Trump presidency is going to be. Just take the intelligence community. It really is unheard of for an incoming president, a president-elect, to have such a language towards the intelligence community who he is supposed to work with. I think during that news conference, he said that if they were found to have leaked that information, it would be a blot on the intelligence community. He didn't really mince his words in that respect. And in other areas too, he was certainly, in his trademark sense, very forthright in the way that he addressed some of the concerns, certainly around Russia and the intelligence community.
And Rajini, tell us about what he has said he will do with his vast business empire and how reassuring his plans will be to those who worry about a conflict of interest.
Well, that was always the concern. Now, Mr. Trump has said that he is going to hand control of his company to his two sons, although notably his daughter Ivanka will no longer have any dealings with the Trump industries either, because she is moving to Washington, D.C. and her husband, Jared Kushner, is going to be one of Mr. Trump's advisors. But many people say that that doesn't go far enough. There are some that say he should have actually sold off his business assets to avoid a conflict of interest. Now, during that news conference, there was a bizarre moment where one of Mr. Trump's lawyers took over from him and set out some of the groundwork for his business dealings and showed piles and piles of paper as well and documents. And during that conference, she tried to address some of those concerns. She said that actually there'd be more of a conflict of interest if Mr. Trump was to sell off some of his companies, because there would be issues in terms of him receiving the royalties from those businesses. Others said that he should have put some of his industries into a blind trust. That isn't going to happen either. So effectively, at the end of 4 years or 8 years, he can then take over the company again from his sons.
And briefly, Rajini, if we had thought that a press conference might indicate a thawing of relations between Donald Trump and the media, we were wrong.
Yes, although he did start by thanking members of the media who had seen those reports and the reports, of course, the unverified reports, and not gone with them and not published them. But on the other hand, even before Mr. Trump came on, his advisor and spokesperson Sean Spicer and then Vice President-elect Mike Pence both laid into the media in their trademark style, saying that the media is biased, the mainstream media. And also we keep hearing a lot about fake news now, even in Mr. Trump's tweets. So it just sets the tone for the kind of relationship that the media is likely to have with the Trump administration going forward. And of course, CNN couldn't even ask a question during that news conference.
Rajini, thanks very much. Rajini Vaidyanathan in Washington. And we'll be back in the US a little later to talk live about another marathon questioning a Senate confirmation hearing, Donald Trump's choice for Secretary of State. Rex Tillerson has been trying to calm fears about his relationship with Moscow. Now, there has been a dramatic drop in the number of migrants seeking asylum in Germany in the past year. Official figures show that 280,000 claimants arrived there last year, compared to 890,000 in 2015. The German Interior Minister, Thomas de Maizière, said the decrease was due to the closure of the Balkan route and the migrant deal between the EU and Turkey. Our correspondent Jenny Hill has this assessment from Berlin.
Well, it's tempting, first of all, to imagine the German government breathing a huge collective sigh of relief because, of course, these figures represent a real reduction in the number of people seeking asylum in Germany. Bear in mind that just the year before, nearly 900,000 people arrived in this country, and that triggered not just social disquiet but huge political turmoil too. These figures are not only a significant reduction, they actually come much closer to what some of Angela Merkel's critics have been calling for, an annual upper limit of 200,000 migrants every year. So on the one hand, there is, I think, a sense of relief here. But even ministers admit there are huge challenges ahead. First of all, there are still hundreds of thousands of outstanding asylum applications. And then there's the business of trying to integrate the people who've been granted leave to stay and those who will be allowed to stay. This is an election year for Germany. Angela Merkel's government have to persuade a pretty nervous German electorate that not only can integration happen successfully, but that it can also ensure it'll identify any potential terrorists who've managed to come in with that migrant influx. I think too any sense of triumph might be tempered by the fact that actually this reduction in numbers has very little to do with any kind of domestic policy. Angela Merkel's government has gradually toughened its asylum policy, but the reason these numbers are down is twofold. First of all, it's to do with the fact that those countries along the so-called Balkans route closed their doors to migrants, in effect sealing off the major route through Europe into Germany. And ministers, I think, are also painfully aware that this reduction, these lower numbers, is also very much reliant on that migrant deal struck between the EU and Turkey. It's a fragile deal. They don't really know if it's going to hold. At the moment, it seems to be doing so, but it is precarious.
Jenny Hill in Berlin. Well, the winter freeze in Europe is hitting migrants particularly hard. In Greece, temperatures plummeted to freezing levels not seen since the 1960s, with rare snow falling in Athens on Tuesday. The BBC's Howard Johnson's travelled to 2 refugee camps just outside the city to see how people are coping.
It's so cold at the night. The situation is very bad.
It's not good, very cold. Everybody have children. There's cold, you cannot stay. Now it's not water, nothing inside.
So I've just arrived at the Malakasa refugee camp here. There are around 40 families inside there, and there's an impromptu demonstration here against the conditions in the camp this winter. We would have a look inside ourselves, but we were denied permission. Apparently there's a blanket ban on media filming inside the camp at the moment.
The containers didn't have a door, didn't have windows.
It's very frustrating to me. It's not like people didn't know winter was coming. It comes every year. You know, just like clockwork, winter hits. In this particular camp, the only winterization that's been done as far as infrastructure has been done by us. We built out the first floor so that we could move the families in from the tent. And basically, none of the large organizations could manage to do anything with the infrastructure.
Last night I'm good because I have 5 blanket. When in the morning I getting up, I get up and just cold. That's it.
Today is fight of a snow fight, and girls and boys fighting with the snow.
That report from Howard Johnson in Greece. Now a look at some of the day's other news. Italy's Prime Minister Paolo Gentiloni is recovering from heart surgery in a hospital in Rome. He fell ill on his return from a meeting with the French president in Paris. His office said he was awake and in touch by phone. Mr. Gentiloni was due to meet the British Prime Minister Theresa May in London on Thursday. That meeting's now been postponed. Volkswagen has pleaded guilty to criminal charges and agreed to pay over $4 billion to settle the emissions rigging scandal in the United States. VW admitted in 2015 it had installed software in hundreds of thousands of diesel cars in the US to cheat emissions tests. There are still ongoing lawsuits in Europe. Norway's Attorney Generals told a hearing that the imprisoned mass murderer Anders Breivik has to be kept in isolation to stop him spreading far-right ideology and inspiring further attacks. The state's appealing against a lower court ruling that keeping Mr. Breivik isolated had breached his rights. French police investigating the robbery of the reality TV star Kim Kardashian have released 3 people, including one of her chauffeurs. More than $10 million of jewellery was stolen in the raid on her flat in Paris. 14 others are still in custody. Police are considering whether it was an inside job. The UN envoy for Cyprus says talks in Geneva to reunify the divided island are on track. The country's Greek and Turkish leaders have come together after several failed attempts at reunification. In an exclusive interview, our correspondent Selin Girit has been speaking to the Turkish Cypriot leader Mustafa Akıncı.
Diplomatic graveyard. After numerous attempts at peace falling one by one for decades, that is what many people call Cyprus. But could there be an end to the conflict in sight? Turkish Cypriot leader Mustafa Akıncı told me the time has come for a united Cyprus.
We need to set up a united federal country now. After 50 years of separation, it is high time that we are able to create a better future for our younger generations, to develop peace culture, to develop federal culture, and to prepare a brighter future for them.
Cyprus has been divided along ethnic lines since 1974, when Turkey occupied its northern third in retaliation for a Greek-inspired coup. The Turkish Cypriot state founded in the north is recognized only by Ankara, whereas the Greek Cypriot state is a member of the EU. Peace talks are currently underway in Geneva, but there are hurdles ahead. Security, the presence of the Turkish military on the island, a rotating presidency between 2 communities. Just some of the biggest concerns. But Mr. Akıncı does not want to contemplate failure.
If we try to speak about plan Bs and so on and so forth, of course this might create suspicion in the minds of other people, saying that the Turkish side has other plans, they don't really mean business. This is not the case. We will do our best with all our determination, we will focus for a solution. But if we go again to the referendum and we get another no vote from the Greek Cypriots, of course you cannot stop the life.
Like many of the protesters last night in Nicosia, Mr. Akıncı believes these talks could be the last opportunity to bring peace to the divided island of Cyprus.
The younger generations, I believe that they will not focus on a federal setup in the future, because they are growing far apart. They are becoming aliens in their own country. They are like tourists visiting each other's site, and they don't share a common vision for the future. It is the last trial of our generation, most probably last chance for a federation.
The Turkish Cypriot leader speaking to Selin Girit. Let's return to the US, and before Donald Trump gave that news conference in New York, his choice for Secretary of State and America's top diplomat, Rex Tillerson, was facing questions from a Senate confirmation hearing. Now, many politicians have expressed concern that the former CEO of the oil giant ExxonMobil could be too friendly with Russia's President Putin. Now, Mr. Tillerson told senators that Russia did pose an international danger, but it was in fact US foreign policy to blame.
Our NATO allies are right to be alarmed at a resurgent Russia. But it was in the absence of American leadership that this door was left open and unintended signals were sent. We backtracked on commitments we made to allies. We sent weak or mixed signals with red lines that turned into green lights. We did not recognize that Russia does not think like we do. Words alone do not sweep away an uneven and at times contentious history between our two nations. But we need an open and frank dialogue with Russia regarding its ambitions so we know how to chart our own course.
Rex Tillerson there. That hearing is still going on. Let's talk to Barbara Plett-Usher, who's live from Capitol Hill for us. Barbara, I mean, a hugely influential figure if he is confirmed as Secretary of State, but how tough a time did Rex Tillerson get?
He got a lot of questions about Russia policy for reasons that are obvious. The position of Mr. Trump and all the scandals floating around with regards to Russians' interference in American politics. But I think on that, he was probably broadly reassuring to a lot of the senators. He advocated a tough line. He said the Americans should get tough with Russia when it behaved badly, but he also said it was necessary to try to cooperate with the Russians on a range of issues, and they needed to have a frank conversation about whether the Russians would only see them as an adversary or whether they could have some other kind of relationship. Not friendship, he said, but some other kind of relationship. So I think that's something a lot of the senators wanted to hear. Not all of them. Some of them pressed him on Mr. Putin's record, particularly his support for Syrian bombing of Aleppo, and Mr. Tillerson declined to say that he was a war criminal, which upset some of the senators. I think another thing to say is that on some of the issues where Mr. Trump has been a little bit away from traditional policy, or he's been overly critical, or people don't quite know where he is, Mr. Tillerson has sort of taken a middle line. So, for example, on the Trans-Pacific trade deal, which is a big part of the foreign policy approach of this administration, and it's also important to a lot of Republican senators, he said he didn't oppose it, which Mr. Trump does. He didn't oppose it, but he felt they could probably get a better deal. And he took a kind of middle line on some of those issues, which I think, again, will reassure a large number of the senators.
Now, one senator we heard giving him a particularly tough line of questioning over Vladimir Putin was Senator Marco Rubio, who you mentioned, the former Republican presidential hopeful. I mean, if someone like Marco Rubio doesn't back this nomination, how much jeopardy does it put the whole thing in?
Well, the Republicans have a majority in the committee, so there would have to be two, probably three Republican senators who would vote against him. Now, no Republican senators have outright said they would do that. So there is a certain amount of leeway there, but I doubt very much that many would cast a no vote, and I'm not even sure that any would. Perhaps Mr. Rubio would, but I think especially because you're looking at Mr. Tillerson as a contrast to Mr. Trump. And Mr. Trump has dismayed a lot of the Republicans with his own sort of freewheeling and sometimes inflammatory approach to foreign policy, in which he suggests that he might be questioning traditional basis of it, which Republicans accept. So I think Mr. Tillerson might be seen, even those who would oppose him, could well be seen as a lesser of two evils. But this issue about Russia is very important to a small group of senators in particular. So we can't say entirely for sure which way they would go.
Barbara, thanks very much. Barbara Plett-Usher on Capitol Hill as that hearing continues. Thank you. Now, just before we move away from American politics, a quick mention of President Obama. He set a new personal record on social media after his farewell speech last night in Chicago. He took to Twitter to say, "Thank you for everything. My last ask is the same as my first. I'm asking you to believe not in my ability to create change, but in yours." Now, this tweet has become his most popular to date, with more than 1 million likes and over 500,000 retweets. Now, let's just remind you of our main news. Donald Trump has accused the US intelligence agencies of leaking information and putting out false claims that Russia has compromising information about him. He was particularly critical of the US intelligence agencies and certain members of the media. Don't forget, you can get in touch with me and some of the team on Twitter. I'm at Karen BBC. We also have a BBC Facebook page. Thanks very much for watching BBC World News Today.